Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Khaled and I will be your host for this session. Good evening and welcome to our webinar, How to Negotiate SPA, a Seller's Perspective in association with Avendus. The session will be presented by Vaibhav, Parikh, Parag, Srivastava, Shreyas, Bhushan and Amit, Singh. A quick brief about our partner organization Avendus. Avendus is a leading provider of financial services and lays emphasis on creating customized solutions in the area of asset management, credit solutions, investment banking, and wealth management. Please note that this session will be in listen-only mode and will last for about 60 minutes, of which first 30 to 40 minutes will be spent on panel discussion and the remaining time will be available for Q&A. Requesting all the participants to be on mute mode for this session, and you can post your questions in the chat window while the panel discussion is on. The moderator will queue up the questions for the speakers accordingly. Should you need any assistance during the conference call, you can use the chat option. Do note that this conference is now being recorded. I now welcome our session presenter, Vaibhav Parikh, who heads our US operations and is based out of our New York office. Parag Srivastava, leader Corporate Transactions Group. Shreyas Bhushan, leader Corporate Transactions Group. And our guest speaker for this session, Mr. Amit Singh, Executive Director, Investment Banking, and co-heads the Enterprise Technology and Services at Avendus. All participants are again requested to put their lines on mute mode. Over to you, Mr. Parikh.
Thank you, Khaled. Thanks for the introduction. Before we begin, I'd like to thank each one of you for dialing in. And we also at NDA sincerely hope that all of you have been keeping safe and healthy during these challenging times. Now, as most of you are aware, the theme of today's discussion is to focus on the various nuances which a seller must consider while negotiating an SPA, both in the context of PE and M&A transactions. Let me start the session maybe with you, Amit. Deal activity definitely seems to have taken a hit because of this all geography pandemic. So just so that we have the macro commercial picture correctly identified, do we now see this as a seller's market or do we see this as a buyer's market? That is one. And second, in light of what has happened, what do you think are the key commercial factors which will guide deal making, M&A and PE deal making in the next 1 to 2 years?
Sure. Hi, thanks, Shreyas, and I hope everyone is doing well. So let me start quickly by saying I don't think there is any market at the moment. So forget about seller's market and buyer's market, right? We are seeing two distinctive trends. One, deals which were in the very last stage of execution or negotiations, they have kind of continued, though maybe at a very slow pace, but they continue to see some kind of forward movement. But as far as new deals are concerned, they have actually come to a complete standstill, because the fundamental of any deal making is valuation, and valuation is a clear function of your ability to project future financials. And at this point in time, nobody has any clue. Forget long-term financials, even the ability to project FY21 numbers. So I don't see any deal activity happening, which is a fresh start. So I think from that standpoint, deal activity will wait for some more clarity to emerge. Now, what will determine deal activity going forward? I think the biggest elephant in the room is going to be financial stability, right? And cash would reign supreme, to my mind, right? Because absent your ability to pay your working capital and your fund your day-to-day operations, I think most companies are going to struggle, and that is going to be the single biggest determinant for sellers to come into the market. If they are comfortably placed on account of their cash position, I don't see any seller coming to the market in this environment.
Got it. Thanks, Amit. That was helpful. And maybe let me just pick up the threads from here and set the tone for the discussion going forward as well. And maybe Vaibhav, you can sort of help with this. Given what we've understood on the market, let's maybe deep dive into what really we see in SPAs and how we really negotiate SPAs. So can you maybe set forth the most important macro level themes a seller should focus on in the context of an SPA, a sale agreement, maybe both in the context of PE and M&A transactions?
Thank you, Shreyas. Taking from what Amit said, right, that currently the situation is such that there is no activity going on right now, especially because you can't determine the valuation. The key aspect here is, post 2 months, 3 months, once the lockdown goes away, once a little bit normalcy comes, right? Will there be activity? Will the activity be buyer friendly or seller friendly? Assuming that it is going to be, buyer's market, seller may not be willing to come if they have cash sitting with them. If they don't have cash sitting with them, then there may be distress sell which may come up with. In some situation, buyer may be distressed and may want to buy so that they can complement or synergize, because now buyer is looking for a partner or a company which they can do to shore up their revenues, right? So I do see that there will be activities which will start happening in a short while. And when that happens, if you are a seller, depending on whether you are a distressed seller or you are a selling to a distressed buyer or buyer who is keen to buy you out, right, with a good negotiating power, you have certain things, from negotiation perspective, certain clauses which you need to keep in mind. And also, when you talk about being a seller will have multiple types of shareholders, right? You will have a promoter and then you will have investors. If I broadly put it in this range, right? I mean, there may be family friends, there may be private equity investors, there may be angel investors, but I'm not going into those kind of details. I'm just going to say, okay, there are promoter or promoter group, and then there are investors, right? These are the two categories of sellers I'm currently looking at. If you really look at from promoter perspective, right, the key aspect in their mind, and again, all points what I'm trying to say are important, but some are more important than others. And if you ask me what is the topmost in the mind of seller, right, and what should be the topmost in the mind of seller, right? If you are a promoter, then the topmost thing in the mind would be limitation of a liability and earnout and employment and price valuation, right? So price adjustment and some of the other things. So what are these three things, right? If you are a investor, then earnout and employment agreement may or may not be relevant to you. Especially the earnout generally may not be relevant, but occasionally it will be. Employment agreement will not be relevant to the investor. But the limitation of liability and price valuation will be very critical, right? So this two will be critical. From promoter perspective, when you look at the earnout and the employment agreement, right? In my mind, this is very critical because this is long term, right? A lot of other things are short term. So when you are negotiating, what you need to keep in mind is that something which is long term, you need to pay extra attention, because when you are doing a deal, right, initially your relationship is pretty good, right? So sometimes even if things go for a toss, right, you can resolve it much easily. But as time goes by, people change, circumstances change, situation changes, and hence how you, if the issue comes up, right, it often goes for litigation. And how you drafted your clauses, how have you worded and how you negotiated, that becomes very critical. So amongst everything, keep in mind that something which has long-term implications, something which has a long window, is critical for you to negotiate well and give a lot more attention, right? But again, I'm saying that all are important, some are more important. This is just which falls into that category. The other thing I was saying was limitation of liability, right? From promoter perspective, limitation of liability can be in two situations. One is, what is the maximum price which I need to pay if something goes wrong? What is my liability, right? Post transaction, and how long this liability will last, right? And often we see this into three different buckets, and I will not go into detail, but broadly the buckets are, you have title or fundamental reps, where the liability is higher and the time period is higher. Then you have a tax and sometimes IP bucket, where the liability and time periods are lower than fundamental, but still not very low. Typically, they are, for tax, it will be 8 years at least, 7 years plus the financial years between 7 and 8 years. And then limitation may be a little bit higher than standard limitations for other reps. And third, which are the business reps, where it is slightly lower compared to the other two, where time period can be anywhere between 18 months to 3 years, and the limitation of liability can be anywhere between 10% to 35% of the cash given, right? And then of course there is an escrow concept, which is a separate point, and especially if PE investors are involved, then escrow becomes a very important aspect. We'll not get into that right now. Then the price valuation is very critical. I think we will look at that as we go through in the session, especially how do you value, how the value adjustments happen post deal is very important. The other things which are critical are reps and warranties and indemnity. Basically, your limitation of liability will protect you in terms of what is the maximum amount you will pay, but your reps and warranties and your indemnity will decide when your liability gets triggered. So that is important. But if you have a good control on limitation of liability, you can manage reps and warranties to some extent. And then deal certainty is very important, right? Often you need to look at it. Now, again, when I say deal certainty, what I'm saying is that once you sign it, right, how certain it is that you will close the deal, right? Multiple things depends on it. First, what is the time period? If you have lesser time period between signing and closing, then your deal certainty increases. When you want to have lesser period, which means you need to have lesser number of condition precedent, because more condition precedent, more time it takes between signing and closing. Now, if you want to have a lesser condition precedent, again, you need to look at it when you negotiate, what condition precedent are within my control versus what is not within my control. Something which is in my control, I know how long it can take to close it, and if I'm confident that I can deliver, I can agree to it. If something is not within my control, then it goes back to say, is it something which is mandatory, which means there's a customer consent. Without customer consent, I can't close the deal, which means I need to have it, right? It may not be in my control, but that's mandatory. If there are regulatory approvals, it's mandatory, right? So that is something which is critical. So that is the aspect you need to keep in mind. But if something is negotiate out where you can move it from condition precedent to condition subsequent, especially if it is not in your control, that will improve your deal certainty. So often that goes into the equation of how do you get the deal certainty, right? And also then the standstill clauses and the other aspects on deal certainty, whether you have a MAC clause and others, are important, right? So we'll go through that in as the session goes in detail. But in my mind, these are the few critical aspects which we need to keep in mind. Again, I'll repeat saying that other clauses are also important, but some are more important. And if you need to choose what you want to really focus on, then these are the clauses you really need to focus on. Shreyas, over to you.
Thank you, Vaibhav. Thank you for the very comprehensive outline. I think this pretty much sums up what we'll be discussing through the session as well, broadly. One of the topics you mentioned was indemnity and how indemnity reps have to be tackled. And this is arguably the most contentious segment of any SPA that we deal, reps and indemnity. So Parag, let me maybe put this across to you. What do you see as the key challenges faced by sellers while negotiating rep and indemnity clauses? And how different are these for, let's say, PE sellers vis-a-vis management / promoter sellers, both PE and NDA transactions?
Thank you, Shreyas, and good evening, everyone. So, as Shreyas mentioned and Weber also mentioned that, reps, warranties, indemnities form one of the most important parts of the SPA, and a significant amount of time is spent on negotiating these aspects. So, before we get into the details or the key aspects of what sellers should keep in mind while negotiating these documents, I will briefly touch upon on what are reps, warranties, and what are indemnities. So, basically, reps and warranties are statement of facts which are given at a particular point of time, from the sellers to the acquirer, and they relate to various facets of the company and the asset that is being sold. And indemnity as a result is the remedy that is available to the purchaser in case of a breach of a reps and warranty or any other provision of the transaction document, right? Because the buyer is getting into the company, while buyer does a due diligence of the company, but there are aspects of it which can remain unknown. So reps and warranties help buyer mitigate that risk against those unknown events, and also it helps in finding out things about the company which comes in the form of a disclosure letter or a disclosures that the sellers or the company make. Now, what are the important aspects that need to be kept in mind while discussing or negotiating a reps warranties indemnity? So let's break it up into few parts, right? So most important question is who should be giving these reps and warranties and indemnities? And as Shreyas mentioned that there is a slight difference in depending on the nature of the seller while you are negotiating the reps and warranties and the indemnities. So in case there's an individual promoter or a promoter group who's giving the reps and warranties, obviously they are more connected to the business, they are more involved in the business, so they'll be able to give representations across all the aspects of the company, including the business of the company, as opposed if it's a private equity player or an investor who's a pure financial investor who's not involved in the day-to-day activities of the company. It will not be possible for them to give any representation with respect to the business, because unfortunately they are not involved in those aspects. So what happens in this case, it's very important to keep in mind is that especially for private equity players, right, that they should never get into the while they'll be able to give the reps with respect to the shares they hold, assuming that this transaction is through a share purchase, and we're not getting into asset purchase, but they won't be able to provide reps and warranties for the business of the company, right? So the question is, and I'll just jump a bit here to indemnity, because if I am not giving reps and warranties for it, then who should be giving reps and warranties for the business aspect of it, right? So for a private equity player, because they cannot give, typically it should be given by the promoters or it's given by the company. But obviously the corresponding, because the sellers are getting paid here and not the company, and the promoters are getting paid only for their shares, it's typically the private equity players and all the sellers together take care of that indemnity provision. Now, an interesting thing that we should keep in mind, and a specific situation is where it's a promoter-driven company, and there are other individuals also involved in that business, right? But not as intricately as the promoter. There's a concept of joint and several representations and warranties and corresponding indemnity, right? Which basically means that while everyone is giving these reps and warranties, the buyer has a right to proceed against any of the parties, so it's a joint and several liability. Here it becomes very, very important, especially for that promoter to keep in mind, whether, because while every other seller is getting the money for it, more often than not, because the promoter will probably continue in the company, so there his neck is on the line, because he'll be the easiest person to approach in terms of for the buyer to claim that indemnity, right? So it's very important for the promoters to push back and not agree to these joint and several liabilities. And there are various ways to mitigate this risk, which is, as Weber mentioned, escrows, right? So there can be indemnity escrows, which can be placed so that the buyer has comfort that while these other sellers will no longer be around, some of their money is still parked in an escrow situation where the buyer can dip and get the money from an indemnity perspective. I think second important point is who the indemnity is or the reps and warranties are provided to, right? So typically it's the buyer, but if you see, buyer will include a broad statement in terms of it should be given to the buyer, the affiliates, the employees, agents, directors, representatives of the buyer. So the seller should ideally try to limit the scope of the persons who are getting covered. And obviously, the buyer will obviously include the company also, because a breach of a business rep more often than not will result in a loss for the company and not directly for the buyer or any of the persons that I mentioned earlier, right? So it's very, very important to limit the number of people and to whom these indemnities are given. Next point is, what is the indemnity for, right? So as I initially mentioned, that indemnity is a recourse to the buyer for breach of the provisions of the transaction document. In certain cases, we have seen, buyers put while the standard on breach of reps, warranties, and covenants, etc., is there, right? Something that we have seen sometimes buyer put is a generic statement saying any event that happened prior to closing, and if there's a loss, then the purchaser and the other party should be indemnified for it. So it's very important to push back on this, because already the buyer is taking an exhaustive, set of reps and warranties which they want to protect against. And, it's best for the seller to know what they are getting into. So, it's better to negotiate a detailed set of reps and warranties with the buyer rather than, agreeing to this, this broad statement where you may not know what you are exactly, getting into, right? Then, as Weber mentioned, I think the most important part, see, while you can negotiate the whole ambit of reps and warranties and indemnity, I think the most important part is negotiating the limitation around it, right? Because that sets the tone, in terms of, what is the contingent liability you have, because, that's an event that will probably happen in the future, right? So you should be very sure of what is the exposure that you are getting into, right? So here, few things, and limitations can be twofold. One is in terms of time limitation, and second in terms of monetary limitations. Now, if we come to time period limitations, right? I think Weber already briefly mentioned that for certain set of warranties which are fundamental, which relate to the title of the shares that are being sold, or the valid existence of the company, and authority and capacity of the buyer to sell the shares, right? That there is no restriction on them to sell the shares and they own these shares, right? Probably the limitation will be slightly longer, right? More often than not, the buyer will ask for this to continue in perpetuity, while in some cases for individual sellers and all, it may be possible to agree to give it, but you should always try to negotiate to put a time limit to it, because as the time passes and if there is no claim, the probability of a indemnity claim also reduces, right? So it's better to set some sort of time period which can be 10 or 12 years at max, during which these fundamental warranties can be claimed against, so that beyond a point of time you are off the hook. This becomes even more important for private equity sellers, because all these private equity investors are structured as SPVs, and they have a limited fund life, right? So beyond a certain point of time, they will have to wind up the SPV and distribute the funds to their LPs, right? So accordingly, they cannot agree to a perpetual warranty, because it becomes very tough for them, because that will in some cases imply that if an indemnity claim is there, either the general partner should back it, or there should be a clawback from the LPs, which generally funds want to avoid, right? So there should be a time period, again limit linked to the fund life of the investor, right? Another point, I think the second thing I mentioned was in terms of monetary limitations. It's very, very important to include monetary limitations in the for an indemnity claim. Now, monetary limitations can be of three types, right? One is the overall cap on the indemnity, right? So typically, for a long time, the standard was that, and still a buyer will ask for 100% of the, purchase amount as indemnity cap for the fundamental reps. But, or even, sorry, business reps, you can actually then in that case, what you can do is you can segregate the reps and warranties and the indemnities for it, while it makes sense if you're selling an asset, to probably agree to 100% purchase consideration in certain cases. For business representations, it doesn't make sense, right? And in the overall scheme of things, the indemnity amount should not exceed the total money that you receive, right? Now, it is also a function of, the caps is the kind of issues that have been identified in diligence, right? So, for example, if the buyer has noted that, let's say the tax compliance of the seller has not been very good, of the company has not been very good, sorry, in that case, they'll probably ask for a higher, limitation for the tax reps or any particular, for example, if it's related to IP, they may ask for a higher thing. But in case, if the company has very good, tax compliance, etc., there you can, as a seller, you should definitely push back on this and try to limit the exposure, because, in that case, you have proven that the tax compliance has been very good, or general overall compliance level for the company has been good. And accordingly, there is no reason for the buyer to ask for a higher amount. Even in terms of business warranties, we have typically seen that it should be limited to, it can range from 10 to 30%. Again, depends on the kind of risks that have been identified in the diligence. And accordingly, you should negotiate it, keeping it in that in mind. I think, yeah. One more thing is, which can be tried in terms of, limiting the scope of the reps. I think that's also very important. While limitation of liability is a key thing, but I think another thing that the sellers can pay attention is to limiting the scope of the reps, because buyers will typically include very, very broad statements, in terms of reps and warranties. And especially in cases where, while the ownership of the company lies with certain people, the management of the company, if it's with a certain other set of people, it becomes even more critical, because while, you may be giving those reps and warranties, you may not be in know of those things, right? So there it becomes very, very important to limit it. What is your knowledge, right? Again, there are concepts there, in terms of whether it should be your actual knowledge or it should be done with, after reasonable due and care. So that while that can be negotiated, it's very, very important to negotiate a knowledge qualifier into the reps. And similarly, there's another thing, which is the materiality, because, companies, especially big companies, may have multiple aspects to their business, right? May have multiple contracts. It's there. You should, as a seller, negotiate with the buyer, in terms of what are the key aspects of the business, and reps and warranties, because a breach of only those key aspects of the business will result in a real loss for the buyer, right? So you should incorporate appropriate materiality qualifiers, right, for the reps. And similarly, there should be materiality qualifiers for the indemnities also, right? So for example, if it's a 100 million deal, right, an amount of probably 10, 15, 20, 50,000 will not be relevant, in those scheme of things. So you should agree to indemnify the buyer only if there's a significant loss which exceeds certain monetary thresholds that your liability should kick in, and anything which is lower should not probably be get into. There's also something called a de minimis, which is a very, very nominal amount or a small amount, looking at the purchase consideration, and that should be completely excluded from indemnity claim. So it becomes very, very important to negotiate these numbers. And as a seller, you are while there are certain market standards in terms of what these should be. They range from, for a de minimis it will be 0.01%, for a basket beyond which the indemnity claim should be there is 0.1%. But your business best, so it's always makes sense to argue on the fundamentals of your business, and what should in the looking at the deal structure and your business, what should be the those thresholds. Yeah. What do you stress? Yeah.
Shreyas, you are on mute.
Got it. So thanks, Parag. Thanks for that explanation. This was helpful. And maybe while we're on the point of indemnity, let me also pick up one of the least controversial provisions, let's say in an SPA, which is the standstill provision. Oftentimes, what we've noticed is that while these are least controversial, parties tend to overlook the regulatory issues involved in standstill provisions, and this exposes parties to potential litigation. Typically, there are maybe, and let's just spend maybe a few minutes on what these issues could be, regulatory issues. Typically, what we see is that there are two kinds of issues. One is an acquirer specific issue, and the other is a seller specific issue. For the acquirer, I think it's fairly simple. It's a gun jumping issue. As most of you will be aware, India as a jurisdiction is a pre-consent jurisdiction, which basically means that, let's assume you've entered into a transaction and the transaction requires certain regulatory approvals, let's say a CCI approval or any other regulatory approval. Parties first go to the regulator, get the approval, and then proceed to closing the transaction. But what we've also noticed in some cases is the acquirers, while negotiating transactions, put in extensive and stringent standstill clauses that could effectively amount to acquisition of control even while the regulatory approval is pending. So let's say every key decision with respect to a certain target has to be subject to an acquirer approval. That's one example. Similarly, there is very stringent standstill obligations that acquirers insist on. And in situations like that, one has to be careful not to trip over the legislative requirement of first getting the approval and then closing the transaction, and not effectively closing the transaction through standstill provisions and then going for another. This is obviously picked up by most acquirer counsel, and language is suitably modified so as to address this concern. This is from an acquirer perspective, but since we're speaking and focusing mostly from a seller perspective in this session, let's also look at whether a seller can be impacted by standstill provisions. The one part of it obviously is the commercial side of it, on what kind of standstills can a seller provide. Is that something that will impact the business, not impact the business? Should it be limited to outside the ordinary course of action so that the business runs smoothly, etc.? This is really something that commercially people look at. But there's also a regulatory issue for standstill provisions for a seller. And this is in a very specific context under competition law, and maybe again specifically relevant in the context of strategic end. This is an issue where commercially sensitive information, and this is an accepted and a well understood concept in competition law. Commercially sensitive information will be divulged, let's say, by one party and an M&A to another party during a deal-making process for DD or for the purposes of standstill, etc. Let's maybe spend a couple of minutes on what the law is on this. As a principle, under Indian competition law, cartelization is prohibited. where it has adverse effects, let's say like fixing of prices, or geography split, limitation of supply, etc. The obvious question that comes up when I say cartelization is prohibited and commercially sensitive information, the obvious problem statement is this. In any deal, if commercially sensitive information has been provided by one party to the other, is it at all possible that the two parties collude with each other and distort the market while a CCI approval is pending? This is the problem statement. The answer to that, of course, is yes. If we look at, let's say, for instance, a Snapdeal and Flipkart merging tomorrow, is it at all possible that if they know of the commercially sensitive information of each party, they can collude and distort the market? The answer to that theoretically is yes. But then, and in fact, before I go forward, in an agreement, in a situation like this, where let's say CSI has been exchanged between the two parties, if CCI were to proceed with an action, the onus will lie on the parties involved in the M&A to say they haven't colluded and not of the CCI. So it sort of puts the parties at a back foot and in defending an action initiated by the CCI. So this really is the problem that you face when you disclose CSI. But there's also the reality that in any deal, you have to provide commercially sensitive information for meaningful deal making, for anybody to take a call on whether a deal can proceed, specifically in large strategic M. So what really is the answer to this? Yeah, and the answer to this lies in the concept of clean teams. And instead of maybe explaining clean teams as a concept, let me describe what clean teams do. And this by itself should be a self-sufficient explanation. A clean team process will probably involve 2 or 3 steps or processes. One, each party to an M&A will first identify a certain set of individuals. These are individuals who are not involved in the operations of that party, or who can be dispensed off of their operational responsibilities, let's say for a few months. Then this party, which has identified the individuals, will tell the counterparty that please share all your commercially sensitive information only to these identified set of individuals. These identified set of individuals will then analyze and examine this information for whatever purpose that is required. Say, for instance, if they need to figure out whether the deal can go through or not, or if they need to figure out whether there's been a breach of a standstill provision, etc. It's really the responsibility of these identified set of individuals to figure this out. Once a CCI approval comes through, obviously these clean teams will be folded and both teams can integrate. But in the event a CCI approval does not come through, actually, then what do you do is the question, right? So what do you do this with these individuals whom you've identified as clean team individuals who are probably part of your organization or one of your consultants, etc. What you do is you obviously do the deal termination processes and mechanics, and then you get the individual who's part or individuals who've been part of the clean, you get them back into the organization, but you don't put them in an operational role. You keep them off of operations for a cooling off period of, let's say, 6 to 12 months maybe. And this 6 to 12 month period, typically, like as you see in listed companies for UPSI, should serve as sufficient time for commercially sensitive information to no longer be commercially sensitive. Let's say by efflux of time or by whatever reason it is, you go by a certain cooling off period so that you can demonstrate to competition authorities that despite the deal not getting CCI approval, you've taken adequate precautions so as to ensure that once the clean teams have been folded, there is no anti-competitive practice, so to speak, between the two parties, because the people who had access to CSI are no longer involved in the operations and they've been back in operations pretty late as far as that party is concerned. So in effect, I would say these are really the key considerations that a seller must think through while accepting standstill provisions. And parties should be very careful, both the acquirer and the seller, in fact, should be very careful and set up robust data protection processes while discussing strategic M&A transactions. And Vaibhav, do you want to add anything on this?
Yeah, thanks, Shreyas. I'll just, we are running late on time, so I'll just add 1 minute here. That from regulatory approval perspective, especially in software services sector, what we have encountered that there are few approvals of foreign jurisdiction, specifically in the US, which become very relevant. Now, if you see most of the software services companies, right, would have a huge set of customer in the US. And because of that reason, they will have employees who will be stationed in the US, either on H-1B or in L-1 or some other visas, right, or local employees. And often those employees would have given ESOP. And because of that reasons, sometimes securities law in the US can get triggered. Amit and we have worked on few transactions where this became a major issue because you needed to go over the securities law of the US, and that added up a lot of time and cost to these whole transactions. So that is something you need to keep in mind. Recently, if the acquirer are non-US and if software services invariably has subsidiaries in the US or huge client base in the US, then in addition to antitrust, in the US, you also need to look at the CFS approval. Now, CFS approval, which was earlier relatively non-existent, have suddenly become very critical. So while we don't practice US law and we don't advise on US law, this is something which we encountered as an important part to flag off whenever you are doing a transaction, specifically from seller's perspective. Over to you, Shreyas. I don't want to take time on this. Yeah. Maybe Parag or you have next question on Amit?
Yeah, I will ask. Yeah. So Amit, I think as Vaibhav also mentioned, and we all know that, in any deal, actually, price is the most important, aspect that is in both seller and, buyer's mind. And we note, there's always a lot of discussion, in most of the M&A deals on closing adjustments and mechanisms, that are put into the SPA for achieving that. So, here I would want to ask you, few points on these adjustments and mechanisms. So, key being, what is the concept of a post-closing adjustment? What is the rationale for including this in the SPAs? In your experience, how does this work practically? And when you have been representing sellers, what are the main financial parameters that are on seller's mind? And in your view, what should they keep in mind while negotiating these provisions?
Sure. Thanks, Parag. See, I mean, as Vaibhav was mentioning earlier, when we think of designing any sell-side process, right, we try to optimize obviously for valuation, but also for speed and certainty. Now, if an SPA, for example, is being negotiated in an exclusive fashion, there is a certain element of uncertainty that has already been brought into the process itself, right? Ideally, I would like to be in a situation where we don't have exclusive conversations, even while having an SPA discussion. And another very important of uncertainty is what we call the bridge between the enterprise value and the equity value. Now, funny as it may sound, 99% of the time, we only discuss enterprise value. But the sellers get paid on the basis of equity value, which needs to be determined in an accounting sense, right? And the gap or the variables that determine the bridge between enterprise to equity are essentially a couple of key elements, right? The first one is the gap, if any, between the actual closing working capital position versus a defined threshold. Second is the actual cash position as opposed to a defined threshold. And third is the actual position of what we call as the debt and debt-like items, right, at the time of closing. Now, all of these things, as you can see, are all have to be determined in an accounting sense, right? And it is very difficult to predict the actual balance sheet position as on the date of closing, right, absent a formal audit, right? So the whole concept of post-closing adjustment is essentially to basically give accountants time after the deal has been done to find out what was the exact balance sheet position as on the date of closing, right? And that's really what that concept is and why it is important. In fact, it is one of those concepts which actually throws up a lot of surprises, because the equity value may look very different from the enterprise value conversation that the buyer and seller might have been having for a long period of time, right? Now the precaution that one obviously needs to take is to ensure that you remove as much of subjective interpretation from the calculation to the extent that you can. And the biggest one is to make sure that the accounting standards that are being followed for calculation of this post-closing adjustments are very similar or well known, especially in light of what the seller has been doing prior to the transaction. So that's number one. The second one, which we have found very useful, is essentially to insert a illustrative calculation of how this working capital and other calculations shall be done once the deal is closed, right? So an illustrative example really helps, right? And the third important thing is basically we have this concept of an estimated closing balance sheet, right? The idea is to make the estimated closing balance sheet as accurate to reality as we can, so that the delta of what needs to get paid post closing is limited to a minimum, right? So that's the third point. And the fourth point I would say is to have a legal mechanism where the payment, whatever is due to the entitled party, is paid as quickly and as efficiently once that post-closing adjustment has been determined. So I think these are the broad concept and the mechanism that we follow to kind of make sure there are no slips between the cup and the lip.
Thanks, Amit. And while we're on this point, let's also maybe touch upon one other critical aspect that involves a detailed level of negotiation of the commercials, which is on the aspect of earnouts. Now, we've seen various promoters in hindsight regret the fact that they haven't negotiated an earnout clause properly. There are a separate set of legal issues that come on earnouts, or on whether your earnout is pursuant to an employment agreement or is it pursuant to a purchase consideration. Should it be taxed as salary? Should it not be taxed as salary? Or should it be capital gains? When do you pay the tax, etc., etc.? And these are issues maybe we can pick up separately. But purely from a commercial perspective, when let's say a seller promoter in an M&A transaction is retaining a minority stake and has negotiated an earnout, what are the key things that this seller promoter will have to consider while figuring out, let's say, an earnout formula? Or what are the key financial parameters? Let's say, for instance, you have EBITDA as one of the factors on the basis of which you determine the earnout. What kind of EBITDA should it be? Should it be the plain EBITDA you calculate, a normalized EBITDA? What's the difference? What are the key trends that you, or key issues that you come across, and what are the pitfalls that promoters want to avoid in your experience?
Sure. So I think this whole concept of earnout is actually a mechanism to bridge valuation gap, right? Seller obviously wants to get a higher valuation. The buyer is skeptical about the future projections of the seller, and they are not able to agree to a one-shot valuation process. And that's where we basically use earnout as a mechanism to bridge the gap, where the buyer is willing to pay more to the seller, provided they are able to meet the projections that they have put on a piece of paper, right? So that's really the concept. Now, as a concept, earnout is a lot more trickier than, let's say, something like a post-closing adjustment, right? Because for one, the earnout evaluation period is way longer. And second, earnout essentially pertains to the future, whereas post-closing adjustment is especially an item which pertains to the past, right? Now, keeping this aside and assuming that's an important bridge to kind of make it the bridge the valuation expectation gap between the buyer and seller, I think there are a few things which have to be kept in mind when you are negotiating earnouts. By the way, I have generally found more sophisticated buyers to shy away from a long drawn earnout concepts, right? Because they understand the pitfalls and many of the human elements which make deals to fail could also be linked to earnout. But having said that, let's look at from a seller's perspective, right? The first and foremost thing when it comes to earnout is the seller needs to have the operational freedom to go and achieve their earnouts, right, during the evaluation period, right? And this operational freedom needs to be enshrined in the SPA so that there are no ambiguities on this account. So that's number one, and it's a lot more harder to enshrine in an SPA a concept like operational freedom than what it may sound, right? So that's very important. It has to be critically thought through. The second thing is pertains to accounting standards. The sellers and buyers more often than not actually have different accounting standards, and the seller may have a perspective that they will account for revenue and EBITDA the way they have been doing in the past, whereas the buyer may be thinking in completely different terms, right? So it's very important to make sure that the mechanics for calculation of the earnout parameters are very well defined. We have found it very useful to actually agree on the computational mechanics as opposed to agreeing on the accounting standard, because standard itself are open to subjective interpretation, but the computational mechanics may not be. So you can say that, hey, for example, whether out-of-pocket expenses reimbursed by clients, would that be part of revenue or not, right? So I think things like that needs to be kind of jotted down to the extent possible. The third thing is, how do you account for buyer introduced cost, especially if the earnouts are linked to EBITDA? Because buyer may have different standards of security, compliance, IT reporting, and that leads to a certain amount of cost, right? Is the seller responsible for those costs? Will that impact their EBITDA or not? Are stuff which needs to be thought through and kind of laid out. There are other elements, like obviously most people do a deal for synergy purposes, right? Now, question is, if a buyer brings in revenues, right, do the sellers get credit for those? Or is there a mechanism for allocating credit under certain circumstances, but no credit on different circumstances, right? There has to be a very robust dispute resolution mechanism. For example, part of it has to do with operational freedom as well. Like, for example, can the buyer prevent the seller from taking on a certain client or certain types of revenues going forward, because they believe that the quality of revenues are not what the buyer wants, right? So buyer could have genuine concerns, but those need to be thought through and kind of put in place, right? And purely from an legal standpoint, especially if you are representing a seller, we would like to word the document in a fashion where the buyer is entitled to pay the earnout, and the buyer needs to justify why they are not paying the earnout, as opposed to seller having to prove that they deserve the earnout, right? Now, obviously, if the buyer is in a similar business as the seller, things are a lot more complicated. There are areas of overlap, common clients, things like that. If they are in obviously different lines of business, becomes a lot more easier to do some of these calculations, right? So that's on the construct of how you think of it. There are obviously structural issues, right? And I think the one structural issue which takes a lot of people by surprise is taxation. Now, most sellers, even buyers for that matter, tend to believe that the treatment of earnout from a taxation perspective will be similar to the main transaction itself. In fact, to the contrary, it's not really the case. It's usually a different treatment, right? And it could, if it's a cross-border transaction, it becomes even more complicated, and one has to think that through very, very carefully, right? Then there are other things that one needs to worry about. For example, is how do you, because the period of evaluation is long, how do you ensure that the buyer has a sound financial position to pay the earnout, even if they are due, right? And this could also work for in the context of private equity as well, right? and concepts like escrow, putting the money in escrow if the regulations do approve of that kind of mechanism, or even getting parent guarantees as well as LP guarantees in case of comfort letters from LPs, is something that we have used in the past to give sellers the confidence that if they meet the numbers, the buyer or the investor will have the ability to pay for it, right? And again, I think Vaibhav touched upon it in the early part of his talk, is regarding this whole linkage of employment with earnout, right? Uh, most sellers end up becoming employees of the buyer, right, or the buying entity. And what happens if the buyer needs to fire them for any dereliction of duty, right? Which can obviously be misused as well by the buyer. And would the earnout payments cease under those circumstances? So concepts like termination for cause and what is allowed and what is not allowed as cause are again very important concepts to make sure that the seller is adequately protected in an earnout construct, right? So while overall earnouts really help sellers increase the total valuation, it is not really a bed of roses, and it has to be tread with caution.
Thanks, Amit. I think we are running out of time. While we had a lot more to say, we will kind of pause here and take a couple of questions, and then I think we may have covered some of the questions which has been asked, and if you have not, we can take that offline. Let me take first question from Arvind Mathur. Arvind's question is, please give example of any disputes in India about RNW, which is reps and warranties in PE deals, and where seller is PE, right? I think the most common ones which we have seen really is in relation to tax. And second most common ones we have seen is related to regulatory approvals. Let me give you specific examples. Again, I'm not talking specifically with respect to the PE's own tax, right? In a sense, so there are two kind of tax reps and warranties. One, and the first one is when somebody has invested from Mauritius and there is a asked by the government which says, oh, you need to pay tax, in which case what happens? And we have seen in one situation where the negotiation was that the PE is coming from Mauritius and hence there will not be any withholding of tax. But as soon as the deal was announced, the government went after the purchaser saying that you need to withhold tax. And then we had this whole situation folded in. Similarly, then the other situation where we have seen is where companies tax is there, which means that PE has given, or sellers, including PE, has given reps and warranties on tax, and there is certain tax claims which comes in, and then the question happens is how do we pay that? And we have seen situations on that. In fact, currently we are handling one matter where it's a similar situation. Generally, what we see is that if it is within the escrow period, and that's where the key aspect is, the purchaser will lay a claim and ask escrow agent not to distribute the money, and then that money is kept on hold till this is resolved. So this is possibly the most critical and most important aspect we have seen, followed by regulatory approvals, regulatory penalties. I will move on now since we need to take another question. Shreyas, there is a question on gun jumping specifically for you. The question really is, this is question from Ayush Kashyap. He's asking is that are clean team becoming a norm in India, especially when CC approval is in the picture? Also, what are the other precautions buyer taking to avoid gun jumping? Shreyas, can you spend a minute or two on this?
Yes, let me also maybe club this question with another question from Ritesh Shah, which was on the lines of whether an investor or whether parties are in fact entering into non-disclosure agreements with the clean team members. I think the first answer to that, yes, parties will enter into non-disclosure. That is, people who are part of the clean team will enter into non-disclosure agreements. That's one. Second, Is this becoming a norm in Indian deal making sphere? Yes, the answer to that will depend obviously on the nature of the transaction. But by and large, yes. It also depends on, like I mentioned, the nature of the transaction that you're in, the strategic M&A. Do you have a CSI that is being exchanged? Two parties operating in the same market? Can there be a possible cartelization argument that can be made by authorities, etc., etc.? This is fairly common outside of India when you look at strategic M&As. And to your point, Ayush, yes, it is becoming a sort of common practice even in strategic M&A here in India.
Thank you. Oh, sorry. I thought you were. Go ahead.
Sorry, Vaibhav, I wanted to just pick up one more question that came through and probably address this to Parag, where the question says this: does an investor who intends to sell give all the representations and warranties and hence the indemnity associated with it to the buyer? Or do investors not give it, and is there somebody else who gives the reps and indemnities and warranties in case of, let's say, a PE? The question.
Okay, thank you, Shreyas. So see, in terms of, I briefly touched upon it also. See, because while an person who's a financial investor, will obviously give reps and warranties with respect to, its authority and, capacity to sell, and also the title to the shares that it holds. But, typically the representations related to the business and operations of the company is not given by financial investors. It's either given by the promoters or the company itself. But the investor, because it is receiving the money, will provide indemnity for those representations to the extent it is receiving money. So it'll be divided in proportion to the money received by all the sellers. So so while the investor does not give the reps, it provides the corresponding indemnity for that.
Yeah. Thanks, Parag. Amit, maybe we can take the last question to close this session. Amit, this is for you, and then maybe Parag, you want to add, or Shreyas, you want to add, you can add. This is question from Akshay Madan. Key negotiation point to be kept in mind when the promoter groups have pledged their shares in the company to the lender for personal or corporate loans, as it will have conflict with drag and tag rights that an investor generally requests to protect his investment. This is obviously in a situation where it's not a full sale, it's a partial sale. Amit, maybe you may want to have some thoughts on it.
Sure. I think the most important thing is full disclosure, right? I think if you have shares pledged and the investor has a tag or drag rights, I think we need to disclose this fact appropriately. There is nothing much you can do beyond that in those kind of situations, and just make sure that the investor is comfortable in a construct like that, right? Now, typically, if you are doing a minority transaction, right, tag or drag is really not to be applied immediately. It is meant for the future, right? I think as long as you have a path to kind of getting those shares out of those locked-in status within that certain grace period, call it 3-4 years, whatever is the period before some of these events kick in, I think you should be fine.
And on this, Webunar, just to add a couple of more points, we see this in commercial discussion issues whenever we look at promoter sale where the promoter stake has been pledged. The first discussion that happens is, yes, of course, the promoter, once the sale is done, will be released of all his or her obligations under the respective lending documents. But there's also the question of who's going to replace this obligation now, because the incoming PE will be, let's say, the incoming buyer or the PE will then have to pledge its stake so that the lending facility continues with the company. So there's always the discussion on whether the incoming investors are fine with it. Is there any other security that the investors can provide? Can they look at an alternate method where security is provided by, let's say, the company itself, and some sort of comfort letter is provided by the PEs, etc.? This is one point that gets picked up quite often. The second point that we see typically in public deals, in fact, is where between, let's say, the stage of signing and closing, you also run the risk of enforcement. Just to give an example, let's say we pick up the COVID issue. What happens is that the lenders will be ready to give the NOC just very close to the transaction completion, so that once the transaction proceeds hit the seller or an escrow, that amount is used to replace the facility provided by the let's say lenders, and this is in respect of amounts that have been lent to the promoter in their personal capacity as loan against shares. Now, what we see in this cases is an instructor is always concerned that between the time of signing and closing, because of, let's say, a situation like COVID, if the share price has fallen drastically, then you call up for margin. Margin is not helping you. You'd have to enforce the security while it is still in good shape to make good the proceeds. So this is again one other concern that parties encounter. There are different forms of solution structuring that happens, but this is one of the key commercial issues that gets picked up by examining lender consents in case of PE transactions.
Yeah. Thanks, Shreyas. I think by this we'll wrap up. We are over time by 4 minutes as we started at 8:30. I mean, at 9:05. Sorry, 6:05. I'm in US, so I still have to mentally calculate that time. Over to you, Khaled, for closing.
Thank you so much, Veep. And I thank all the panelists here, Shreyas, Parag, as well as Mr. Singh. Thank you so much for your valuable inputs. And I would also like to inform our participants about our sessions for this week. So today evening at 9, we have how to view ethics in AI. So that's a very interesting tech topic that we have. As well as tomorrow at 3 p.m. we have hospitals in India, time to scale up, and the roles of investors, which will be taken by our pharma practice experts. So do join us. You can register on LinkedIn as well as on our website. You can go and look up for the webinar details. So I once again thank everyone, all the participants as well as panelists for having this session. Thank you so much.